Hello, and welcome to the CISA 2 Building Educator Capacity Podcast, where we strive to improve student learning by expanding the capacity of our school districts. Once again, I am Phil Anderson in the Communications Department, and I'm joined again by co-host Mitchell Lilly, who is the Executive Director of Marketing and Communications at CISA 2.
Hey, Phil, thanks for having me on again.
Today, we are joined by one of our representatives at one of our CISA 2 districts at Wisconsin Heights, Liz Dostal. Liz is looking to implement school improvement into her own school, narrowing focus and providing supports to improve education. In this podcast, Liz goes over her steps and thought process to get students and staff to buy in to change their thinking and teaching process, even if they already think what they're doing now is good enough.
Chatting with Liz on today's episode is Ed O'Connor and Elizabeth Freeman. You'll remember them from a previous episode on the capacity building framework. Liz Dostal has worked in public education for 27 years. She has a BA from UW-Eau Claire in English education, a MS from UW-Stout in school counseling, and an MA from Marian University in educational leadership. She now serves as the middle and high school principal at Wisconsin Heights Middle and High School. Her areas of professional interests are curriculum development, instructional pedagogy, adolescent literacy, and career and social learning.
So Liz, I'm so glad we get to have a chance to chat today because as always, I so enjoy chatting with you and spending time talking about the things that you've done in your setting to kind of move along continuous improvement at the secondary level. So one thing I was curious about is if you could tell us a little bit or talk about how you have kind of created that staff buy-in to engage in this improvement work. And one thing I know a lot of staff at different schools that we talk to struggle with is how to respond to students if staff aren't buying in. So if you could talk a little bit about how you've created buy-in and then tell me a little bit more about what you've done if you have staff that are having a hard time buying into what you're trying to work with them on.
So when I think of school improvement efforts that I've done in the past, some of them have been like too broad. So I thought it was really important to narrow our focus right away. And then when you narrow that focus, provide support at the same time. Because when you don't narrow that focus, what seems to happen is that any sort of practice then meets the criteria. So if you start too broad and you say, well, we just want to increase kids' ability to read, what can happen is that people say, well, I already do that. I do that through this and I do that through this. And so I don't really need to change anything because I'm already doing those things. But when you narrow it to something like we need to increase every student's ability to read complex texts, you're unlikely to have people say, oh yeah, I already do that. And so you can start from the big data, which I always look at the ACT. So you can look at the composite and the subscores, but then start to dig down. And when you look at that text complexity benchmark and what kids need to know, then you can say, okay, what does that look like in your discipline? Which is huge for secondary teachers. They're not teaching generic reading, they're teaching their content. And there's reading in every content. So you have to make it so that they can say, oh, complex text. Well, where do kids encounter complex text in your discipline? And so often it comes down to at the secondary level, well, through vocabulary, for sure. And then dense ideas and more sophisticated language. So you have to change the conversation so that you get at what specifically is happening in your discipline. And then, okay, what do you need to change in your practice then to get at it? Because otherwise you don't have anything tangible or practical for them to wrap their hands around. And we all want kids to do better. But like, it's kind of like when a kid asks a teacher, well, how can I get a better score on the test? Well, study harder. Okay, yeah, that's not going to help because they still don't know what to do specifically. So it's the same with teachers. You have to say, okay, this is what complex text means. What does it look like in your discipline? Now, what do you think specifically would need to change? And for the most part, you get buy-in with that. But I think you always have people who are resistant. And for those types of people who maybe struggle to wrap their head around it, you need to offer more support. And to me, what I've discovered is not buying in is often a symptom of fear. They're afraid of doing something wrong. They're afraid of creating more work for themselves. They fear investing time in something that's eventually going to be abandoned. And they've been burned before. We've all been burned before. So it's having that conversation of where they're stuck and then saying, okay, what can I do to get you unstuck and move you forward? So I always offer, like, I try to live by this idea that you practice what you preach and you do what you say you want your teachers to do. So I have always offered, like, I will come in and teach your class. I will teach the method. I will model it. So you can see what I'm doing, what language I'm using with your kids, how I interact with your students to get them moving forward on a concept. I have often offered to help them write the lesson plan, or if they're really struggling, like, I don't even know what to pick for a text, I will help them pick the text. And those are the very tangible supports that show teachers, especially teachers who are resistant to change, that you're willing to do the work with them, and that you'll partner with them and support them. And it doesn't have to be perfect right out of the gate.
Yeah, and that's one thing I think that I've loved kind of watching in your district and in your role. I think you really model that, gradual release of responsibility that we're expecting our educators to do with kiddos. Like, so if when you're first introducing a topic, you will model it at a staff meeting so that I do, we do, you do. I think you so seamlessly do for your staff, and that sets them up to be able to do it with their kiddos. So that's been, I think, really, really nice and fun to watch in action.
So this is Ed. I'm wondering if it might not be helpful so I really appreciate your description of the process for building consensus about the need to change and creating those rationales or sharing those rationales. And also, it sounds like giving staff an opportunity to have some feedback and have some discussion about those elements. I'm wondering if it might not, for your current action, and I think it's obvious from your description that you landed on instruction to support effective reading of complex text. That's kind of what your innovation or the focus practice you were scaling. I'm wondering, can you just give us a little bit of an example around how did you come to focus on that piece, and what did that look like in terms of your building consensus with your staff that was a good thing and a place that you needed to change?
I think the key was starting with the data and the ECT. Our reading scores, when you look at them on the surface, they weren't bad. We had good proficiency, and it always can be improved. But when you look at it on the surface of that subscore, okay, we've got some work to do to get more kids to push that composite up so it's hitting benchmark. But, we're not doing too bad of a job. The thing what really was revealing to me, though, was when you dug deeper, and ACT has a measurement of understanding text complexity. When you look at that, then the problem really is revealed, because we had over half of every graduating class not able to read complex text. So yeah, they might hit the general benchmark for reading, but when it came down to the type of reading that they're going to have to do as an adult, they weren't doing so well with it. And that's where that narrowness helps, because until you know that, you don't even really know what to focus on to improve reading. Because looking at complex text is not just comprehension, it's language and style, understanding vocabulary. So there's so much more to it, but there's specific things you can do to get at that.
Great. So what I hear you saying is digging deeper into the data. You had done these surface level looks at the data and everything looked pretty good. And yet when you dug deeper into the data, that revealed some specific weaknesses that made sense to your staff when you highlighted those, and folks sort of did folks sort of accept that as, oh yeah, that makes sense, probably something we can work on, and it would make sense to focus on that area?
I think it did, because I don't know if they had anyone like drill down that narrowly. And then what I was able to do is like say, okay, so we have this part of reading in the reading test, but then if you look at the math test and you look at the science test and even the English test, they all have elements of reading within them, and they're based on complex text. So having people understand that the science test is a reading test on science content. The math test sets up story problems that kids have to be able to wade through and answer. You know, English is looking at language and how language is used. So the more kids are exposed to more sophisticated language through reading complex text, they're going to do better on an English test. So it's seeing that understanding complex text is a high leverage skill across every discipline. And the more practice kids get with that, regardless of discipline, they will rise, because it's lather, rinse, repeat. Okay, we're just going to keep doing this across every discipline, and making kids aware of the fact that, hey, this is a skill you need. Right now, when we look at your class, less than half of you can do this. So we're going to really target this with you. It helps get that kid buy-in too. They understand why they're doing all this reading. They're understanding why they're learning a strategy.
Yeah, so making it relevant across and important to all across the disciplines was a big part of your consensus building. That's great.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I love even the idea of everybody in your system, all the different stakeholders, from kiddo up to staff, up to you as admin, up to your superintendent. And I know you haven't mentioned it, but I know also your board, having everybody be invested on that narrow focus and knowing the rationale behind it and working towards it, right? So your students can say, oh yeah, this is relevant, and I know why we're lather, rinse, repeating across my different classes. So one kind of other thing I was hoping maybe we could chat a little bit about, Liz, is this idea that you've already shared, but I think it's especially relevant, so I want to highlight it, is at the secondary level, teachers are very focused on their content area, right? And so you've paid some attention to this idea that, you know, this goal, this area of focus can be relevant because of the text across your different content areas. Are there any other things that you think are important to highlight for how you've made this work at a secondary level, where the grade level teaming structure is different? It's content area, you know, kind of structure. So talk to us a little bit about anything you've done, you know, at the secondary level to make this work for your staff, given their focus on their content.
I think if you want people to change their practice, you have to figure out how you're going to sell them on the idea that I'm not taking away from your content. We want to increase your kids' access to that content. And this is the way to do that. That has been huge. The other piece that has played into this is we connected the school improvement goal, and we had that be our SLO for the whole building. We had that be our PPG for everyone in the building. So all of the work they were doing for improving was not just a one and done. It was something that was meaningful. It connected to EE, it connected to, you know, student learning, and it connected to professional practice. So like, for example, this year, the overarching goal is still increasing students' ability to comprehend complex text or understand complex text. So the SLO is we want a 5% gain on students meeting the complex text benchmark across all tests. So ACT Aspire interim, ACT Aspire summative, forward, and the regular ACT. So that's our universal benchmark. And, you know, it's nice because obviously reliability, validity are there. So they don't have to worry about that. And then the PPG is that by April of this year, they will have incorporated 4 of the reading strategies, 4 of the 6, into their practice and regularly be using those with students to help them access text. So they're not just learning random strategies that they apply for 6 weeks at a time and then abandon and go do the next strategy. So what we've done is crafted more of a system and a systems approach in that, okay, we roll these out over time, but we don't discard them once we've learned them. We add them and we start to make note of, okay, this is the best place to use Cornell Notes. This is the best place to use the frame. This is where I'm going to use close reading in this unit. So the ultimate goal will be that by the end of the year, teachers are going to feel confident with these tools in their toolbox. And as they plan for next year, they're going to be able to say, all right, in this unit, I want to use the frame, I want to use concept definition mapping, close reading, and we'll use Cornell Notes. And this is where I'm going to use them. So it's not artificial. It's just become part of like, this is how I deliver my content, because I know that kids learn my content best when they can read and then they can make sense of it in these written forms.
So it really seems to me from what you're describing that staff have to feel, gosh, this is integrated work, this is deep work, that they're being given the time and the space and the support to really delve into these topics. So I think that, to me, that really speaks to, if I imagine myself being like a member of your staff, I would feel very encouraged. And some of those fears you first started talking about at the beginning of our time together, I think would be diminished by the idea that I know you're not going to abandon this. I know that it's integrated and relevant for my other work. I know that by embarking upon this, I'm also going to be meeting my PPGs and my SLOs. So I have to think that that helps your staff buy-in and your staff confidence in this process. One thing you just mentioned that I want you to talk a little bit more about is you said, when they're planning for next year, they'll know better, maybe when to use the different strategies to increase that understanding of complex text with their students. So do you view this as more than just a one-year thing? Kind of how long are you planning on embarking upon this for?
So we are in the third year of the same school improvement goal, and it's taken us this long to dabble and experiment and then come to consensus around what strategies have worked best for us as practitioners and what we see kids responding to. And next year is more of a full application inculcation year, where the goal is for it to become seamless with them, so that when they plan a unit, when they look at what their essential standards are for a unit and how to get kids there, they see reading as an integral part of it. And they also understand that these strategies are key to students understanding and hitting those essential standards. That's going to take minimally a year, and I'm thinking more like 2. Because changing practice, getting comfortable, and applying these is going to take a year of experimentation of pulling them into what they have for plans and how they understand what they're teaching, and then just to feel comfortable with it. So to me, you're never going to get change in a year. And this takes, to me, I think it'll take at least 5 years to go through. And then in that 6th year is when I'm going to see, like, okay, this is just the way we do business. And this is the way we make sure things happen here.
Yeah. So there's so many ways, and we have so little time, Liz. I love what you're saying and how you're describing it. So just in response to what you just said, so there's a bit of an incremental approach to scaling across time that involves, what we might call some usability testing, adjustment and adaptation as you try these things and learn them and figure out what teachers know and can do and where they need support. And then it takes, a couple of iterations maybe before you're able to even land on the real definition of what the practice looks like and works the best, and then scaling it to sustainability. So I think that's a powerful description of why this work takes time, as you said. I have one question. How do, and maybe this is, I don't remember if Elizabeth, if we have this on our range of questions. I apologize if I'm overstepping here, but how do you measure and capture information about, the delivery of these practices as you described the PPG goal? So we've got 4 of 6 of these. Um, how do we capture the information? That's something we're recognizing in education is really important, but we don't have a lot of experience in capturing data about practice.
So this year, we have been doing cycles of professional learning in about a 4 to 6 week turnaround. So we started the year and I taught one specific strategy that was totally new to everybody, Cornell notes. And part of what we did was I modeled it, we did it together, and then I met with teachers who felt like I need just a little more explanation or just practice with you before I would take it to kids. And then they took it to kids, and what they had to do was have a peer either come into their Zoom to watch them teach it to kids, or they had to share with a peer their lesson planning and how they were using it with students. Then about 6 weeks into the school year, we brought them back together and debriefed on Cornell notes, and then they had to do a reflection and share with each other samples of their work. So by doing that, they also were generating artifacts for their PPG. So they were able to make you do the double dip, as I like to say. So like it gave them more things that they could upload into EE if they wanted to, but it also just gave them a chance to talk to each other as practitioners and see what worked, what didn't, and then what things they were going to try next with that. So right now, teachers are in the last 2 strategies. I did a training on the frame, which is out of the University of Kansas, and then my colleague, my assistant principal, did a training on concept definition mapping. So now by the 15th of February, which is our next PD day, they need to implement the practice that they were trained on, try it with kids, see what works, what didn't, lather, rinse, repeat, send us some evidence on how it went and what they need to work on. And then on the 15th, we'll flip. So all the people that I trained on the frame will go to Mr. Pickett to learn concept definition mapping, and I will get all of his people to learn the frame, and we will do it again. But then at the end of that cycle in March, we will send out a reflection. It's a 5-slide reflection where they just go through with their peers and they have a conversation and answer the questions together about, okay, what was awkward about this? What really worked within your discipline? Where would you use this in the future? What things would you change? How do you see it becoming part of your practice? So getting them thinking about not just in the moment, but then predicting forward about how can I keep using this and where is it going to fit best for my students and within the content that I want my students to learn.
So I love the way you're leveraging the educator effectiveness routines to meaningfully support the school improvement plan. I think that's really the intention, right? So nice.
I think it is. And it's like, but I remember when EE came in, that was not communicated very well. And I think that people thought, oh my gosh, I have to do all these goals. And so teachers were coming up with goals that may or may not have been connected to what the school needed to improve. And so then they felt like they were overburdened because there's just so much like, well, I'm doing this for this, and I'm doing this for my SLO, and I'm doing improvement. And I just wanted to make sure that, no, we're going to do one thing. We're going to do one thing well, and we're going to keep doing it until we get to a point where we're at mastery and it just feels like this is going to work. We don't need to change it every year. You don't need to create this. I can write it for you. and you can just cut and paste it into SLO and PPG land, and we're going to be good to go. And then everything we do through professional learning and in-service and things like that are going to provide you the training, the learning, the experiences you need, and the practice that you need so that you feel confident taking it to kids and then sharing those results with your peers.
I think that's so powerful.
Yeah, and the other thing I want to highlight on, Ed's question about, gosh, kind of what changes have we seen in teacher practice since embarking upon this journey? And the other thing in the description you just gave, Liz, which I adore, is that not once did you talk about student outcomes. So you really have kind of taken this stance, which the professional literature very, very much supports, which is we have to make sure that we support changes in adult practice before we even start to expect there to be increased or changes in student outcomes. So the cycle you're going through with your staff, you're not asking them necessarily to look at student data today or tomorrow. You're saying, let's do these practices, let's support you, let's reflect, let's have your peers observe you. Let's make sure that you have ample opportunity to develop that practice before we expect you to be delivering it at a level that's going to change outcomes for kiddos. So I think that's a really powerful piece of your leadership and your experience in your building. I think the other thing that gets me really excited is when I hear you talk about the support you're providing to staff and what you just outlined, because it's different than what we have historically done and what we've seen in other places where it's like, hey, we did a 1 hour workshop on that, or we did a PD day on that. Go figure it out. You're not saying to your staff, go figure it out. You're saying, Andy and I are going to support you. We will show you. We will give you opportunities to practice. We'll give you opportunities to reflect. And so those are some really huge changes, I think, in how we've maybe historically done business in education, and really aligns with the research literature. And I think you're really getting the outcomes, starting to get those inroads that you'd expect. So to me, when I hear you talk, I just get super excited, and we appreciate being able to chat with you like this. One thing I know you've shared with me that I want to touch on before we get closer to wrapping up our conversation is, I remember you saying, and it goes a little bit back to the resistance, but that some of your teachers would say to you, hey, Liz, I'm not a reading teacher. I am a X, Y, and Z teacher. Like, why are you asking me to work on this reading goal? Because that's not what I do. I'm a math teacher. And so real quick, if we could just circle back to that specific, you've outlined with them, this could be your PPG, this can be your SLO. So how did you move them from saying, I'm not a reading teacher, to saying, yeah, that's part of my EE that I'm focusing on reading? What was that process like?
Baby steps. I think the big thing was having them identify, well, where do you expect kids to read in your area? My Phy Ed department has been phenomenal. And actually one of my Phy Ed teachers who's new, this is his third year also. And he laughed the other day. He's like, I'm thinking more about reading and teaching reading. And when I had content area reading methods at the university, my professor laughed at me and said, oh, you probably will never use this. He's like, I'm using it all the time. It's just having them understand that there is reading in everyone's discipline. And then having them see it as a reading piece. For example, music has reading in it, but it's reading music. But there's a lot of vocabulary that's associated with reading music, and you need to be able to do multiple things at once if you're going to play it. So one of the things that I started with music was sight reading, which is a hard skill to learn, and it takes time. So we talked about, okay, how do you have kids sight read? Do you have them pre-read the music and make notation, close read it and make notation of, okay, this is where I need to crescendo, and this is this is where I'm slowing down, and this really needs to be quiet in here? Are they making note of the vocabulary that they're encountering when they're sight reading? And it was just starting those conversations at the very basic level. And I think that helped make the difference for people who were resistant and who didn't see themselves as reading teachers. And I really tried to be in the discipline with them. So my tech ed teacher, at that point was like, oh, well, they read blueprints. And I said, yeah, and there's tons of symbols on blueprints. And if you don't know what the symbols mean, you're not going to be able to build or construct or do what you need to do with those blueprints. So it's helping kids understand that even though it's not traditional reading, it is still reading, and it's a specialized language. So if we don't learn the specialized language, then you're not going to be successful on the job. So it was just finding the in within each discipline.
Okay, so I know we're running long as we tend to here, but I have one last question, Liz. I know that you have shared in other settings the outcomes that you have achieved and some of the, you don't have to give us every data detail, but I think that you've accomplished over the course of time, not on day two, but you've accomplished some laudable impacts ultimately on your student outcomes. And could you just speak to what you've seen so far?
Well, what I've seen is a shift from understanding that the ACT is not the enemy, and that it's a reliable and valid instrument, and we want our kids to do well on it. But that just because we want our kids to do well on it and we're going to teach those skills that the ACT tests doesn't mean that they're giving up their content or they're giving up their discipline. Leveraging your content and leveraging your discipline to help kids be better readers, be better mathematicians and thinkers and scientists. And so that's a huge shift. What I have seen is when I look at last year's report from ACT that shows your 5-year data, we're coming up. And it is not just the low kids that are rising or the middle kids that are rising, it's every level of kids. So when I looked at, there's a chart within the ACT summary data report that everyone gets that looks at kids hitting the benchmark for understanding complex text, and then they split it into 3 groups, not at benchmark, proficient, and then advanced. And so when I looked at the subscores for each group, they had started to go up. So even if a kid didn't hit the benchmark, we had seen a gain of almost 1.5 points over 5 years of the proficiency for those kids that still weren't hitting benchmarks. So they went from like a 14 to, like a 14.9 to a 16.1. Well, that's huge. That's huge, because if you can move a kid 2 points from a 14 to a 16, you've just opened doors for that kid. Then you see the kids that were at benchmark or hitting the proficiency were moving from a 22 to a 24. And the kids that were advanced 30s into 32. Well, those are all huge gains.
Yep.
So what it showed me was the work we're doing impacts every kid and helps every kid rise, which is what we want. So like I always, my vision is like we're increasing learning every day. So for me, it's not just increasing learning of our kids, but it's increasing the learning of adults in the building too. So if we can increase everybody's learning every day, even if we fail at something, you're still going to learn something from it. If we can keep pushing this idea that we just keep increasing the learning, it'll come. Everyone will rise. And you can take a teacher who's maybe medium and have them more consistently be playing the A game every day. And that's a huge thing too. We know that if we can improve the collective efficacy of our staff, if we can make sure more teachers bring their A game every day, we are making changes in not only the lives of teachers, but in the lives of students.
So that, I think, is a very good note to end on. Liz, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and your journey. Hopefully, people who are listening to this can glean some insights onto some things that might be relevant for their settings. But we really appreciate your time and are excited to continue to watch your journey unfold. So thank you.
Thanks.
As Liz was mentioning, in order for this to work, everyone needs to be focused and to buy into the process of change, from the student to the executive board member. In the end, we want kids to improve access to content and understand complex ideas. And usually we have to bring about change in order to do that.
For sure, that buy-in is so important. And educators should avoid the fear, whether it's worrying about whether or not it's going to work or add extra work. when we walk the walk and use the new process ourselves, we can show exactly what we're trying to accomplish and how it doesn't have to be perfect right out of the gate. The district works on the process together.
Exactly, Mitchell. We'd like to thank everyone for listening to this episode of our podcast. Be sure to check the podcast description for links and resources mentioned in today's episode. If you liked our episode today and wanted to hear more discussions, consider subscribing to the Building Educator Capacity Podcast, wherever you might happen to get your podcasts. Special thanks to Liz Elliott, band teacher at Whitewater Middle School and in Whitewater, Wisconsin, for the music used in today's podcast.
Thanks for listening.